Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlik here. So I wanted to make a video about federalism just so we're all on the same page. I know some students learned about federalism in an Introduction to American Government course or maybe in your AP course in high school, but for some students it's been a little while since they really spent much time thinking about federalism. And so, since we're talking about Colorado politics, it's worth just stepping back and making sure we at least all are at an entry point for what is federalism. So we can start with a seemingly simple question of who governs a state, who governs Colorado. Is it the federal government? Is it public policy emanating from Washington, D.C.? Or is it maybe the Colorado state government? Is it people in Denver? Is it elected officials more locally? Is it cities? Is it counties? Is it a municipality? When we're thinking about any state, we can think through, okay, well, who actually governs? And because we're thinking about Colorado, we can be more specific. Okay, well, who governs Colorado? Who is making laws that impact us? And as we know from our discussion, it's kind of all of the above. It's kind of all of often. It's often all of them at the same time, all at once. So the examples that we used in class, or even beyond that, we can think of marijuana policy. Something that students thought a lot about was water usage, public lands. We used the example of education in class, elections, housing. All of these policies, all of these public policies have a federal component, a local component, a state component. So in almost every one of those areas, education, marijuana, housing, elections, when we think about, there are questions about which level of government has the authority. So to answer those, okay, how is the federal government and how is local government impacting those issues, it is important to think about this concept of federalism. So federalism itself is a system in which governing authority is divided between that national level and regional government. So in the US, we can think of this as states. So this division of power, this at times sharing, division of power between the national level and the states. Both levels of government have powers. Both levels of government have powers on their own. So one thing that was brought up in class that appeared in a reading as well is this idea of separation of powers. What we're talking about here is a bit different than the separation of powers. Separation of powers asks how power is divided among Congress, the president, and the courts. Conversely, federalism asks how power is divided vertically among levels of governance. Not necessarily that checks and balances that the separation of powers has, but instead how power is divided vertically. So a simple question that we, as we learn about these things, can ask is, who gets to decide on public policy? We can think about a unitary system. We mentioned it in class, it's worth mentioning again here. A unitary system where the national government is dominant. The public policy comes from the core, comes from the capital, and is dissipated. It is dictated throughout the land. The United States, where we have a federal system, looks different. So the Constitution itself builds in federalism, where some powers are given to the federal government. We used the example of national defense in class, and why power, it makes sense that it is housed at the national level. That each state doesn't do national defense or state defense. They do to some extent, but when we think of national defense, this is housed in the national government. Foreign policy, we know some states have engagements with foreign countries, but for the most part, foreign policy is at the national level. Interstate commerce and, of course, currency. You don't go from Wyoming to Colorado and need new currency. So this is something the national government does. However, other powers and authority remains within the states. Public health and safety. We know there's some national government, but a lot of that is still run by the states. Education, again, some oversight at the national level, but more power to the states to set education policy standards, funding. So elections, we know elections are run by states. Each state runs elections slightly differently. Some of this is in the news about mail-in voting versus voting in person, or different voting ID laws. So voting is a state issue. It's a big state issue, but one that's in the news a lot. And when we think of local governments, of course, within the state level. However, many things are shared. Transportation, we know, isn't just a state issue, and it's not just a national level. Law enforcement is a shared power. Public health, at times, absolutely a shared power. Environmental policy, especially for issues that cannot be solved just at the state level or just at the national level. So this here is probably why, or we could say this is why modern federalism is less about saying this issue belongs completely to Colorado, but instead it is more asking what does Washington do, and what does Colorado do, what do local governments do. We know there's overlap, but we also know these institutions handle public policy differently. So we introduced it in class, but we didn't have a lot of time to dig into it. But I think it's worth talking about here are some of the advantages and disadvantages of federalism. We saw this a bit in our reading as well. So the reading talks about the disbursement of power. States provide another center of political authority, but our reading, Bowman, describes states as potential safeguards against an overarching national government. That states themselves can help dissipate power, so there is not an all-powerful, centralized national government. Important, and I really want to stress this, and we might even talk about this again in class, states can serve as laboratories of democracy. One state can experiment with a policy without immediately applying it to the entire country. Other states can see what works and what maybe doesn't work. Successful ideas may spread through what is called policy diffusion. Policy diffusion, a political science term, but we can think of it as what happens in one state can then be used in another state if it seems to work, or if other states want that policy implemented as well. Reading Bowman gives ranked choice voting and medical aid and dying as contemporary examples. To connect us with Colorado, Colorado itself gives us a pretty obvious example with recreational marijuana, because Colorado was one of the first states to legalize recreational marijuana. We talked about this in class, but it's again important to think about. Colorado, or any state when we're within federalism, can reflect different conditions and preferences that citizens have. We used the example of Delaware and New Jersey versus Idaho or North Dakota. Their citizens have different preferences, their economies look different, so what public policy is being implemented in those areas will look different. Colorado, for our purpose, does not face the exact same problems as Florida, Massachusetts, or even a place like Alaska. Here with federalism, states can tailor to their populations, their economies, their geography, and of course their political cultures. There is something that is interesting, that states can cooperate. It means states don't necessarily have to stand alone. The reading brings up the idea of that the reading brings up this idea that states oftentimes can compete with each other, but they can also work together for shared problem solving. Think of in the West with water usage. But we do know, and we touched on it a bit, that federalism also does have some disadvantages. There are policy inequalities, rights, benefits, public services, taxes, regulation, environmental regulation can vary substantially depending on where someone lives. So we can think of federalism as allowing a lot of policy flexibility, but it also can create political inequality and inequality for services to citizens. We brought this up in class as well, that at times it can be confusing or maybe even inefficient. Multiple governments may regulate or fund the same policy area. That can create duplication. It can also create disputes. Citizens may not even know which government is responsible when something goes wrong. And here, built in, is at times governments can conflict with each other. What happens if the two disagree? Or like we see with medical or with marijuana policy, the national government in many states actually disagree. So a big takeaway is that federalism is this dispersion of power, not like checks and balances, but instead in a vertical manner. That some things are conducted at the national level, while others are conducted at the state, maybe even the local government. This can be marijuana policy, this can be education policy. What else do we use as an example in class? National security policy. So some issues are housed firmly in the national government, while others are at the state level, but we also know there is some overlap. And so federalism, we just have to think about, okay, it's this diffusion of power. And we see benefits, we see some cons, but it is really the hallmark of American democracy. Thank you.